Hello, welcome to the Colonial Waterbird training for foraging monitoring habitats. My name is Carrie Howard and I am the TERN coordinator for Audubon, Texas. To tell you a little bit about myself, I graduated from Texas A&M University with a marine biology degree, my bachelor's. Since then, I've worked a variety of environmental fields, wetland consulting. I was the habitat and stewardship coordinator for Artist Boat for 3 years. We restored dune habitat with the grant programs that we had, and we had kayaking adventures. And then in the last year, I was brought on to the coastal conservation program as the TERN coordinator to expand their efforts, and that's with Audubon, Texas. The National Audubon Society, Audubon, Texas is the state office for National Audubon Society. And the National Audubon was incorporated in 1905, and it's one of the oldest organizations of its kind. Audubon, Texas shares the same values and the mission as National Audubon, being the state office. And the mission, our mission, is to conserve and restore natural ecosystems, focusing on birds, other wildlife, and their habitats for the benefit of humanity and Earth's biological diversity. The Audubon Coastal Conservation Program was established in 1923, and during this year we attained and acquired a system of island sanctuaries along the Texas coast to protect Rookery Island's habitats. What was spurring the efforts with National Audubon Society in 1905 was the decline of several waterbird species. Herons and egrets were pretty much being hunted down to extinction to endangerment levels due to their plumage feathers. During the springtime, they have very elaborate feathers, and those feathers were being used in the millinery trade to make handbags and hats. And so the members that developed National Audubon were communicating very loudly about the need to preserve these bird species. And the Coastal Conservation Program continues that legacy. We manage and protect 177 islands along the Texas coast, and these are Rookery Island habitats ranging from the Louisiana border down to the Mexico. And these Rookery Islands are essential nesting habitat for many of these colonial waterbirds. So what's special about the coastal program is some of the efforts that were started with National Audubon Society are still being continued through the Coastal Conservation Program. And the Texas Estuarine Resource Network, or as what we'll refer to as TERN, this is our community-based programs where we involve citizen science and outreach and education, and what we are hoping to do is engage the communities and public into helping with the Audubon staff and helping to manage and protect the islands, and specifically monitoring some of the birds in rookery habitats and in foraging habitats. What we hope to do is have a network of volunteers that are keeping an eye on our islands and our water birds from the Louisiana Texas border down to the Texas-Mexico border. So to let you know a little bit about the Texas Estuarine Resource Network, it is a community-based citizen science program. We primarily work with waterbird monitoring, colonial waterbirds and other birds. We do conservation and restoration activities. These primarily take place in bird habitat, so they might be restoring marshes with our partners. We also have very large efforts in the fall to get out to the Rookery Islands. We're posting signs, we're planting native shrubs, and we are picking up trash that could be hazardous for the birds as they're nesting. And then we also have a very large community outreach component where we engage school-age youth in schools or homeschool groups, 4-H Club Scouts, and we also have a senior citizen program where we will do programs for senior citizens and also go into senior living facilities where we can engage folks right where they're at. So one of the things I wanted to go over and explain a little bit about was the citizen science and what citizen science is. By definition, citizen science is a collection and analysis of data relating to the natural world by members of the general public, and is typically a part of a collaborative project with professional scientists. This essentially is recruiting volunteers from the public to help gather data, and then this data is used by scientists and wildlife professionals to help interpret what's going on, and also help make management decisions. And also a lot of this data could be used in the future for making policy and decisions that will help maintain some of the essential habitats that these birds need. Most of our very first citizen scientists are very popular still today. Isaac Newton, Benjamin Franklin, and Charles Darwin, they were all considered citizen scientists because they were self-funded and they were not associated with any university or government entity. Some of the oldest citizen science programs in 1880, the American Ornithological Union, they were seeking out lighthouse keepers to help them track what they were calling bird strikes. So as birds were migrating throughout the coastline, they were striking the lighthouse towers. And so what the AOU was doing was reaching out to the lighthouse keepers and asking them to keep track of the birds that were striking the lighthouses. And they were filling out forms and they were returning that. And this information was very helpful in telling us what birds were migrating through the area, what birds we were seeing year round, and a variety of other information about these migratory patterns and the bird species that they were finding. So there are still some lighthouses that still turn in the data sheets as far as what birds are striking the towers. One of the most well-known and very popular citizen science programs out there is the Christmas bird count. It's spearheaded through the National Audubon Society. And it's one of our most successful examples as far as producing years and years of valuable data on population trends. And one of the quotes that I was able to pull from National Audubon Society was, ordinary people have the opportunity to actively help and acquire a great knowledge of the ecology of Texas and contribute to the conservation of our valuable natural resources while involved in activities that they enjoy. That was really the inspiration for the TERN monitoring programs that we've developed, is that we know that folks enjoy being outside, we know they enjoy watching birds, and we wanted to set up an avenue and an opportunity for folks to get out there, maybe track some of these water birds for us, and then allow that data to be used by scientists to help better protect and manage these species and their habitats. So to go into the definition, the Coastal Conservation Program, we specifically are looking to help manage and protect colonial water birds. The colonial part refers to the bird species that are looking to nest in very large groups. And typically what happens on a rookery island is there's a small variety of habitat, and these birds are swarming to these islands during the spring nesting season, and they are literally building their nest within pecking distance. And there's only a few water bird species that are choosing to nest this way. The water bird part of the definition basically refers to water as a source for these birds of their livelihood. So they are living somewhere near water, they're dependent on water for their food sources, much more so than maybe your songbirds or other birds that wouldn't necessarily be considered water birds. Nesting on the rookery islands, we believe that the benefits are primarily is these small island chains along the Texas coast, typically in bay systems, but they have very few predators that can swim out to these islands. So there's a very large motivation to protect their young as they maintain their nests and rear their young on these rookery islands. What's interesting is that many of these birds have a specific preference for habitat, and some prefer nesting in shrubs, some of them in trees, and then many of the bird species actually prefer nesting in low vegetation like marsh, and then there's a good variety of birds that prefer nesting on shoreline and either shell beach or sand beaches. So here's some of the birds that are what we're considering the colonial waterbird species. And so the pelicans are in that group. The brown pelican does nest here along the Texas coast, as the American white pelican does not nest down here on the coast. However, we do see large numbers of the white pelican in the wintertime. The double-crested and neotropical cormorants, we do have several numbers of our neotropical cormorants nesting here. The double-crested cormorant we typically see more in Louisiana and Alabama. We do see some numbers of them in the wintertime. The ahinga, and then we get into the herons and egrets. So great blue herons, the great egret, snowy egrets, little blue and tricolored herons, the reddish egret, and the white morph does nest here along the coast on our rookery islands. Cattle egrets, we can typically see cattle egrets nesting a little further in mainland, particularly because of their food sources and their freshwater dependence. The black crown and yellow crown night herons are also big nesters. They too can be found nesting a little further in the mainland from the coast, but they're definitely here. The white ibis and white face ibis, the roseate spoonbill, which is a very popular bird here on the coast, laughing gulls, the gull-billed terns, Caspian terns, royal terns, the sandwich terns, forester terns, and least terns, and we do see sooty terns. We may not see them nesting here. And then the black skimmers, they definitely nest along our Texas coast. So for the tern monitoring, there's two components. One component is the rookery island monitoring. The training that you're receiving today is for foraging habitat. So I will just briefly go over the rookery island monitoring. The surveys begin in spring. Nesting season for these birds are February through August. What we're hoping to collect for the rookery island monitoring is what types of birds, how many birds per species, and we're interested in numbers of nests and chicks and fledgling. What we're hoping that the surveys reveal is what bird species show up first. How soon are these birds going from nest building to laying eggs, from laying eggs and incubation to hatching chicks, and then how long time frames between chicks and fledgling. We do have some baseline data, and we have some estimates on some of the bird species and how long it takes them to go from chick to fledgling. But what we're hoping with the monitoring is that we'll have more data to support what we already know, and then possibly find out more information as we have monitors and get data coming in. What is really interesting for us is also finding out some information about the disturbance of the rookery islands. These rookery islands are, many of them are owned by the GLO, so there's very few private, and what we typically see is year-round there is access for boat goers and fishermen. Now there is regulation to protect these birds in the springtime when they're nesting, so we work very hard to get public service announcements out and post signs on the island, but we're interested in seeing what sort of disturbance is going on as fishermen are fishing next to those islands, or boat goers are traveling around those islands. What we're hoping is that that if one volunteer is monitoring these islands, say once every 2 weeks, what they can do is help us fill in some of the gap data that we're trying to find out. As I stated, our coastal program we have an abundance of islands to monitor and manage, and so the springtime we're trying to get out to those islands, and 177 of them throughout the year, but we aren't able to visit the islands with the same frequency that a volunteer could if that volunteer lives close by to one of those islands. So the amount of information that volunteers can provide us is very, very useful, and really can't be duplicated by wildlife professionals. There's just not enough of us. One of the limiting factors for Rookery Island monitoring is the fact that you can only get access to these islands either by boat or kayak. There are some bird species that will nest along beaches, and so like the least terns is a good example. You can probably walk up close to the beaches and survey their nesting sites, but most of these you're going to have a boat or kayak access. We will have a separate training for the Rookery Island monitoring. This is primarily because of the very strict guidelines associated with the monitoring protocols, and it's primarily related to how sensitive these birds are during their nesting season and how important it is to have successful nests during this time. So some of the guidelines are, we're not able to land on the islands or do any walking around in that area. We have to maximize our distance, and so we have a rule of thumb which is 50 yards away. However, during the Rookery Island monitor training, these volunteers will not only be trained in the distance, but will also be trained in to watch the bird behavior. And so the the distance from the bird may not be a solid number as much as it's going to be watching the bird behavior and determine how far that you need to be to monitor based on their response to your presence. We are charged with the health and surveying these birds and helping their population numbers. So one of the most important things to us is not just collecting data on these birds, but also limiting disturbance as much as possible as we obtain some of this data. The tern monitoring for foraging habitat. These surveys are much more user-friendly. The surveys can be done year-round, and they can literally be done any place that birds are feeding. So there's a wide variety of habitats that can be monitored for water birds. What we're looking for is what types of birds, how many, what behaviors, and what habitats that these birds are found in. What we're hoping is that we're finding information about what birds are feeding in what areas, what habitats have high diversity, how the habitats are being used by these birds, and then what are the primary behaviors. We assume that they're out there feeding, but there are other behaviors associated with these foraging grounds, and we don't have a lot of information on that. The access can be by boat, by kayak, or by foot. And what we're finding is that the foraging monitoring is a very good fit for most folks because it has very easy access. There are abundant locations, and it can literally be done any time of year, including the spring. So some of our first tern monitors that are looking in foraging habitats for us, some of them are going to some of their favorite nature parks or preserves, and some of them their back patio is overlooking Dickinson Bayou, and so they're able to conduct the foraging monitoring right there on their back porch. So it's very convenient, and it's very easily accessible. And they're an abundant of locations as we're associating foraging habitat is really anywhere that the birds are feeding. So that might include wetlands, it could be a drainage ditch, it could also be a bay system or open water, as some of our pelicans and terns feed. One of the things we feel it's important to let our volunteers know about is why we are conducting these surveys. One of the unique factors of the water birds is that they're not confined. They can pretty much fly anywhere they want to. And so what we're looking at as far as the system is we're seeing these water birds as the top predators of the food web. And since they're not confined and they can literally fly anywhere they want, they're able to determine what areas they want to be as far as feeding. So what we're hoping is that if we can find out the overall health of a wetland and determine it by possibly the presence or the absence of these water birds, we'd like to see if there's a correlation between healthy bird populations and available foraging grounds. And then we're interested in other factors that might support healthy wetlands and feeding grounds. Our hypothesis really is that if these water birds can literally go wherever they want and they're feeding in specific areas, then that might suggest that there's a healthy food web, which might suggest that there's healthy plankton populations, there's healthy seagrass populations, there's healthy fisheries population and diversity in that area. And so what we would like to also know is, does the bird diversity suggest that there's an abundance of food source in these areas? And then how much do scientists really know about the functional use of wetlands? That would tie into some of the other behaviors in these foraging grounds aside from feeding, and actually where some of these behaviors are taking place. And then the other functions is of wetlands. How can that be determined through our observations of bird behaviors? What are the relationships between those areas? So going through and taking a look at how the basic surveys are conducted, what we're asking volunteers is to basically adopt a site. This might be a location that you frequent often. It could be a state park, a nature center, a native preserve, or it could be a local park or somewhere very close to your home. We would like you to adopt a site that you would feel comfortable going to pretty frequently and that you have seen water birds feeding in that area. So the site must contain foraging or feeding grounds, but there's a huge variety of habitats where these birds are feeding. So it can be wetlands, could be streams or ponds. We've seen bay system and open waters opportunity for birds feeding. And so this does include saltwater, freshwater, and brackish water habitats. And then the frequency of surveys, we are asking our volunteers, you may survey that area as often as you like, but we would like to receive data a minimum of once a month. So many of my volunteers, they might be doing bird surveys with other organizations or surveys of other organizations once a month, and so typically they'll go to the same area and document the birds on the data sheet and turn that in to us once a month. Some of our volunteers are monitoring more frequently, and so we're getting data sheets in at least once a week. There is some challenges with getting replication data more than once a week, so our range is you can survey once a week or you can survey once a month. As long as we're getting a consistent data coming in at least once a month, that's sufficient for the site for us to understand the relationships that we're wanting to see between the birds and the habitats there. How we're tracking your monitoring sites. So basically, like I stated, you're going to adopt a site. What we're going to do is, as that data is coming in, we're identifying your site through latitude and longitude. And then we're entering this information into a GIS database. The database will link your survey data with your site information. And then each site will have a unique code name, which is associated with the GIS database, and then a site name, which will be more associated with yourself. So one of my survey sites is Galveston Island State Park, and there's a specific place in Galveston Island State Park that I like to survey. So my site name is really a reference for myself, but I have a unique code that goes with this site at Galveston Island State Park, where it's linked with the data. So if other folks are surveying at Galveston Island State Park, they will have a different survey code based on where they're doing their monitoring. The latitude and longitude, typically we can identify that for you, or there's GIS systems and there's even apps on phones to get that latitude and longitude for you. And then volunteers can survey more than one site if they like, but what we're asking is that if they will turn in the data for each site at least once a month so that we can get that consistent data flowing in. So the next topic is our survey equipment, what you'll need in order to conduct the surveys. You'll need a pair of binoculars. We're going to be looking at these birds from a pretty good distance. You'll need a field guide, and that's primarily for identification of the birds, and then clipboards and data sheets, and then of course something to write with. The TERN program does have opportunities for the group birding surveys where we bring binoculars and field guides. So if you're new to the program and you are interested in checking out a pair of binoculars and a bird guide to get familiar, or perhaps if you have your own binoculars but you haven't yet purchased a field guide, we carry a pretty good variety of some of the best bird guides that you could practice and use until you're willing or able to purchase your own set. And then the data sheets we have available online for folks to print out, or many of our volunteers will also fill out the data sheets electronically and submit them electronically. While you're out doing the surveys typically will take you about 15 to 20 minutes. Sometimes it depends on how many birds you're seeing in that area. So we have some suggestions. We're letting folks know, always bring water out there to the sites with you. You'll want to wear field appropriate clothes. So some of this might include long pants or long sleeves. It's protection from the sun, from other weather elements, and also from bugs. Now, some of this is site dependent. Some of our folks that are monitoring from the convenience of their back porch, we don't necessarily recommend that they put on long pants and long sleeve shirts unless it's really mosquito-y in their area. So depending on the site and the access to your survey site, you'll definitely want to wear appropriate clothes. If it's your back porch, perhaps house slippers are more appropriate for you. And then the field etiquette, this can be somewhat of a sensitive topic. However, we feel that volunteers can be just as effective in collecting survey data if they're trained properly. This is a very important topic for us with the field etiquette. So we want to do right by the birds, but we definitely don't want to cause any harm. So when we're conducting foraging habitats, and this is why the binoculars come in so handy, is we really want to observe these birds from at least 50 feet away. Many times these birds, once we get into an area to do a survey, that they may adjust their distance from us, based on what they perceive as a safe distance. So 50 feet away is approximately 3 to 4 car lengths. If you're in a situation where you are doing a foraging habitat and the birds actually come closer to you, there's really no need to get up and move further away from the birds. If the bird's comfortable with you, then you can stay where you're at to finish your survey. Rookery habitats, I mentioned earlier, we have much stricter guidelines, and our rule of thumb is 50 yards away. That's about half the size of a football field. However, the Rookery Island monitoring, before you can do the monitoring, the training program will teach you how to observe those bird behaviors, and so you may be required to stay a distance further than 50 yards based on the bird's behavior. Some of the things that we would like our volunteers to keep in mind is that we really don't want to encourage any type of trespassing on any property. If it's a state-owned property or it's public and you do have access to it, we would like you to stick to primarily the human access points. There's a lot of very sensitive vegetation associated with these foraging grounds, and it's not just habitat for the birds. There's a lot of fishery species that utilize these habitats, and so some of the examples I have here are boardwalks are perfect places to do surveys. If you've seen worn paths or sometimes our salt flats where vegetation really isn't growing are ideal places to do the surveys, and then anywhere where there's human access points that are pretty worn and there's not a lot of vegetation. What that will do is it will minimize our impact on the vegetation, and will also limit how much interaction we have with wildlife that we possibly don't want to interact with, like rattlesnakes or other wildlife that we're not there to survey. The other thing that we want to caution folks on is, in addition to wetland plants, is the Texas coastline has very healthy oyster reef populations along here, and so we definitely want to caution folks about, if you're kayaking up to an area, you may want to do your survey from the kayak versus get out and stand. The oyster reefs are very dangerous places to be walking. The birds don't seem to have problems with it, but humans definitely do, and so we want to caution you about getting out into areas, particularly if there's oyster reefs around. And we also want to just maintain an attitude of leave no trace. Anything that we take out in the field with us, we want to bring back. So here's a look at the first portion of our data sheets. The data sheets that we prepared have a lot of partner involvement. Some of the partners that we work with, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Texas Parks and Wildlife, and then also university researchers that are looking to do major conservation efforts with some of these water birds. They were very involved in the process of developing the data sheet, and then they were also instrumental in approving the data sheet based on this type of information that we're collecting out in the field. For most volunteers, we're asking to allow yourself about 15 minutes to conduct a survey. We've done several of these surveys, and particularly with groups, and what we found is that a 15-minute is a range. Some surveys, if there are limited birds out there, can be done closer to 10 minutes, and then some areas where we're seeing an abundance of birds, the surveys could take close to 20 or 25 minutes. So it really just depends on the activity that's going on out there. You can see here on the data sheet we have the site code and the site name. Most of our volunteers are able to identify their site by name, and then the site code is given to you by our offices as it relates to the GIS database that we have going forward. Then you'll want to put your survey date. We also have space for the latitude and longitude, so that helps us identify the exact location that you're surveying. Some of the other information on here, we're wanting to know, is this a brand new site that you're surveying? That helps us identify whether or not we need to give you a site code and a name associated with your site, or if it's a previously submitted site, or if it's an area that you are not quite sure if you've submitted data sheets here, or if other people have submitted data sheets for the site, you may select unknown. We're interested in the tides. One of the things that we don't have a lot of data on is weather patterns and bird behavior. And so what we'd like to do is kind of find out what we can associate with that. So the tides play a very large part in feeding for birds as they bring in nutrients and some of their food sources. So we're asking for the nearest low tide to just be recorded. This information can actually be looked up on various websites. NOAA has a very good source. There is also a lot of fishing associated websites that will tell you tides as it relates to weather patterns. And so you could actually record this on your data sheet before you go into the field, as it's generally a pretty static time based on the day and patterns. We are interested to know if any of the tides are wind driven. This might be appropriate if we have a cold front coming through, or a cold front that's already passed through, or if we have any storm systems out in the Gulf that might be pushing water in. We're interested to see if it's a wind driven tide. And then we have these other selections: water levels appear high or water levels appear low. This might be more appropriate for if you're used to monitoring in a certain area and the water levels are really unusual, but there isn't a really obvious weather pattern going on. So maybe the water levels are very, very low, but there hasn't been a cold front coming through or a north wind, or perhaps they're very high. You have an option to select those without knowing if it's wind driven or weather driven at all. And then, of course, some of our volunteers are going to be in areas where there's not a large tidal influence. So these might be some of the creeks or tributaries or even river systems that don't necessarily get a tidal influence. And so there's an option there to click non-tidal. We're interested in the time of the survey. We will relate this back to the time of day that these birds are being seen. And then, of course, if we need to connect them with weather patterns, we can go back and take a look at the time. So you have a space here for start and end time of your survey. The weather patterns, these are basically looking at sky conditions. So is it clear, partly cloudy, overcast? There's options for the electronic to either just highlight those, and we'll see an example of that. The average temperature for the time that you're doing the survey and the average wind speed. Now these can also be looked up ahead of time if you don't have an electronic device or a phone that could look this information up while you're in the field. It's definitely appropriate to take a look at tides and temperature and average wind speed and record this data before you actually get out to the site. Since your survey times are so short in the field, it won't skew the data as far as giving us that information ahead of time. We also would like you to record the observer or observers' names. So if you're out there with a group of people, put everybody's name down. What we're finding, and throughout science really, is that different people observe things differently, and so it's very important for us to know who is taking that information down. And then, of course, if there's some kind of strange anomaly or there's some unusual thing that we're seeing in the data sheets, if we know who is recording these observations and we have any questions, we'll know exactly who to get in touch with to kind of clear up anything on the data sheet that's not intuitive. We have options here for the survey vantage point and the access point. What we're interested in knowing here is, for the vantage point, is this an on-site visit or were you viewing the survey area from an adjacent area? And then you have the option to select it by vehicle, by boat, or on foot. So one example, a current example I have, is a couple at a Tiki Island. And while they do survey right off their back porch, they have in their view 2 small rookery islands that they're doing surveys from. And so at this point, what they're letting us know is that it's not an on-site vantage point. They're actually viewing it from an adjacent area. And then they have even given in the comment period to let us know that they're surveying it through a scope. So they basically are looking through the scope for about 15 minutes. They're observing all of the birds. They're utilizing those rookery islands, and then that's where the data is coming from. The access point is how did you get to that site that you're viewing. So did you get there on foot? Did you have to access it by some type of vessel or boat, or was it accessible by kayak or canoe? These two pieces of information can be really helpful for us, particularly if we see something that we need to get back out to that site to take a look at. We can use this information along with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and looking at maps, and we can actually revisit the site that you're actually doing a survey. So it wouldn't be necessary for you to take us to the site. Based on the information you're filling out each time, we can determine whether we need a boat or kayak to access the site. If there's something going on that we might need to visit the site that you're surveying to get a closer look or a better understanding of what you're seeing. We also have site photo labels. Now, we're encouraging folks to take pictures as they're doing surveys. One of your very first surveys, we may ask you to take pictures of the area. So you might take northeast, southwest photos, or northeast and southwest, just to kind of give us a view. But this also comes in very handy if you're seeing maybe a bird species that you're not used to seeing and it's very difficult for you to identify. Sometimes shorebirds can be really difficult to identify. So the site photo label option gives you the opportunity to label your photos based on the direction that you're taking those pictures. And I will, as we go in to fill out a data sheet, I will go into a little bit more detail about that. The second part of the data sheet section relates much more to the actual birds that we're seeing out there. So one of the things that we're looking for is what are the birds. You can put the scientific or common name is fine with us, or abbreviations. How many adults versus juveniles that you may be seeing out there. What's their primary behavior, whether it's feeding or loafing or preening. And then is there a secondary activity associated with what's going on out there? We're interested in finding out the location, the habitat type, whether they're in low marsh areas or in the high marsh. And then sometimes when you're conducting surveys, we have an opportunity to look at the feeding success rate for some of these birds. And so this might include watching a great egret feed, and you can actually observe how many times he has struck the water to catch fish, and compare that to how many times he's actually caught a fish and perhaps swallowing. It has a lot to do with paying attention to bird behaviors, and that does come naturally after doing these surveys. But for first timers or for folks just getting started and just getting familiar with the surveys, what would still be very beneficial is just to know what type of bird species are out there, how many adults versus juvenile, and then just putting the primary or secondary behaviors as you're learning it. The location habitat is important for us, and the feeding success rate, it can be very useful. However, if you can't observe the feeding success rate, if you can't determine how many fish it's catching versus how many times it's striking, then you can certainly put in a or not available. There are some bird species that we really can't determine the feeding success rate on. The roseate spoonbill is a good example. A lot of times as it's feeding, its bill is just in the water. So we really can't determine, we can determine it's feeding, but we really can't determine if it has any feeding success. And so if you were observing a roseate spoonbill feeding, you could definitely put not available for its feeding success. Also, a good example on here is an unknown shorebird. What we're wanting is for folks to just understand that it's okay if they don't know the exact species of birds that they're coming across. And that will be really common for folks that are new to birding, and we still want to encourage you to get out there. For scientists, it's looking at the habitats that they're in it's still very, very important for us to know that there's a heron out there feeding, even if we don't know the specific heron. So for this example, we have unknown shorebird. It's still very useful for us to know that there's a shorebird out there loafing using the mudflats. And we don't have to know specifically what shorebird it is or what heron species. So still record the bird species even if you are unsure. Same thing with songbirds. If you're seeing a songbird in an area and you can't determine what kind it is, go ahead and put unknown songbird. That way we know that there are bird species out there, songbird species out there utilizing that habitat, even if we don't know exactly what bird it is. These tables relate to this survey sheet. And so these are some of the reminders and options that you'll have. So your behavior types: feeding, preening, loafing, and we have another one that we're considering flyovers. So this picture is a little blue heron that's engaged in feeding, and a lot of times that might be obvious. They're usually poking around the water, some of them slowly, some of them quickly, but they're usually engaged in catching something. The preening behavior can be a little unusual. Typically these birds, they'll have oil glands near the base of their tail, and so as they're preening, a lot of their behavior, what you're observing, is that the birds are very contorted and they're twisting their bodies in order to preen all of their feathers. And so this middle picture is a very good example of preening behavior and how the birds are kind of twisted and turned and taking care of their feathers. And then the loafing behavior is basically when you're observing the birds, they're standing there, but they're really not doing very much. One of the things that scientists are interested in knowing is there are habitual loafing places where birds are specifically looking, where scientists are specifically looking at different bird species where associated with where they're just loafing. And there's some other behavior and patterns that they're hoping to find out from that. So even if the birds don't appear to be doing anything, most animals are pretty intentional. And so there are some very unique things that we can learn about the birds, even if they just appear to be loafing or standing around. And then the flyover is FO, and will be on your data sheet. And so what that one refers to is if you're in the areas and doing surveys and you're just seeing different bird species fly over the area, if you can identify them, go ahead and put them on your survey sheet, even if they don't land in your specific survey area. The feeding success, how we determine that is we basically take the number of captures, the times that birds actually catch a fish or catch their prey, and versus how many times they're striking but not capturing. And so we have them in a percentage where you can just do an estimate. Many of the birds, in order to determine whether or not they've actually got a capture, is the strike of the bird is generally pretty obvious. However, a lot of times the capture, what a lot of birds will need to do is actually throw their head back or straighten their neck out in order to swallow that bird. The feeding success and the rates of feeding success is definitely not a primary category for data collection. So if this can't be determined in the field, there's really no need to stress about it. Just leave that blank. Any data that we collect on feeding success is valuable, but it doesn't take away from the other survey information that we're looking for, such as what birds are out there and how many are out there, and what primary behaviors are they engaged in. Going back to the survey data, the primary and secondary behaviors, just to touch a bit on that, what we're interested in is if you're doing a 15-minute survey, what is the main behavior that these birds are engaged in. So many of these birds might only be engaged in one activity, and so that would be their primary. If the birds, and say we'll use this example, the black-crowned night heron, if he is primarily during your survey engaged in feeding behavior, that would be his primary activity. But then if you observe him feeding in an area and then moving to another area and actually just doing some preening, then that would be the secondary behavior that you record. Typically, your secondary behavior, if you're going on a scale of, let's say, an estimate, a 15-minute survey, it might be a behavior that you're observing for less than 5 minutes. Not all birds will have secondary behaviors. It's just an option for us to capture as much data as possible. The habitat types, again, they completely range. We're just interested in finding out what bird behavior is associated with what habitat. So we have mudflats, open water areas. One of the things that we were interested in finding out is open water areas where the water level is below your knee, and open water areas where the water is above your knee. Now here's how to tell the difference between those two. We're not asking any of our volunteers to get out into the marsh and really measure the water where the bird was between your knee, above or below that. But what we are asking you to do is really observe the bird behavior. So if you see, let's say, a snowy egret walking along, and you know that that snowy egret is only about 2 foot tall, if you can see the majority of that bird's legs, then you would know that if you were standing in that water, that water level is low enough that it would definitely be below your knee. Likewise with the open water above knee, one of the things that we'd be looking for is if you're seeing any tern species or pelicans that are pretty much diving from above. They're not going a deep distance, but it's likely that the water level, if you were standing there, would be above your knee, and in order for those birds to successfully dive bomb and catch that fish. So that's what those two categories. If you're really uncertain about whether or not the water level is above your knee or below your knee, then open water, putting that category down, is completely sufficient for just observing the bird behaviors. The low marsh category refers to the marsh closest to the water line here. And the high marsh category, that's the areas more upland where it's not very close to the water level. Tall grasses, a lot of times you'll see these also in freshwater areas. Cattail is what we're considering our tall grass areas. The shrub, this might be bushes or shrubs, or even what we're calling scrub could be the die-off of old trees. We're interested in birds possibly utilizing this area. Forested areas, these would be found possibly more in riverine systems or streams where there's more dominant tree vegetation than grass. Our ponds, what we're considering those are, could be recreational ponds or duck ponds. And then anything that's used as a man-made structure. So ditches, we would put in that category. Culverts, water detention areas, primarily if they're man-made and not for wildlife use, if they're utilized to help control flooding or water along roadside ditches, that sort of thing, that's what we're considering man-made. As far as a habitat, your stream areas are pretty intuitive. Seagrass beds, a lot of times you'll find this in open water, real shallow areas. If you know, or you can observe some of the seagrass beds, we're interested in foraging in that. But if it can't be determined, again, your fallback is open water. And then, of course, your beach would be any of your shorelines. So like this example, if you see any nesting or foraging along a beach area, it can be a shell beach or a sand beach. Those would both qualify in that area. Some of the other things that you may come across is the banded birds. And so what we've done here is we put up an illustration of recording some of the banding. Some of the bands you will not be able to read the markers out in the field. And so what could be helpful is in taking pictures, recording the bird species if you know it, and then looking at the joints here where we might consider that the knee of the bird, taking a look at what color coding is above the knee, below the knee, as it relates to the left and right side of the body, and the illustration we have set up is when you're looking at the back side of the bird, which is pretty typical, the left and right side from the back side. Most banded birds, well, all banded birds will have aluminum bands. Those are the USGS bands. They're not, you cannot read those from the field. Usually the color bands you can. And then, so if you record the color bands and then also the location of the bands, that's very important. And we have several resources for you to either report those bands, or you can record that information on your data sheet and we can report that band if you're unfamiliar with the process. Disturbance is another very important thing that we're trying to collect information on. The disturbance of an area. And this is primarily associated with human disturbance. We really have no baseline data on human disturbance. So some of the things that we have set up here is the type of human disturbance. There's options to list if it's not recorded here. The quantity, like how many people are you seeing out there? And then the duration. So as you're doing your, let's say, 15-minute survey, how long that duration is going on, and then is there a result or an effect on the bird based on the human disturbance. So the example I have is there are two kayak fishermen. They were in the area, it's my survey area, for about 5 to 10 minutes. And what the result was from the birds is the birds lifted up from the area. They stayed in the air and hovered until the kayakers left, and then the birds came back down. So it's just a basic description. Another one that might be really common, particularly for the bay, is moving boats. I saw one moving boat. It passed through the area in less than 5 minutes. And as the boat passed, the bird stopped. And then as soon as the boat was gone, the birds returned to feeding. And so that would be very appropriate writing down for disturbance. We don't have a lot of information on disturbance, and we'd like to collect more data. This relates to policies that are out there to help protect water birds. A lot of times, if we don't know what is disturbing the bird, we can't take proper measures to help prevent that sort of disturbance. What we're not including as part of disturbance is the natural noises and sounds. So it could be noises from other birds, natural sounds, those types of things we're not necessarily considering disturbance. It's more relatable to human disturbance and human presence. So we're going to just do a sample monitoring. I've selected a few photos to be my field of view for this purpose. So we have we have a great egret here, and he's feeding in the marsh. We have, in my other view, we have a couple of wade fishermen out there. And then in the marsh, in another view, and this is my whole field of view, about 360 degrees of view. In another area, I am witnessing 3 different bird species feeding. So to take a look at a data sheet, one of the things that you'll notice is I have my site code, my survey name, my site name, the date, and the latitude and longitude is recorded here in decimals, not UTM. And again, we can help you with that. It's a previously submitted site because I've been there several times. We just had a cold front come through, so I know that the tides are wind driven. And then I have recorded the time of the nearest low tide here. My survey start and end time is recorded. And then along with the nearest low tide, what I was able to do is document I knew the weather, the sky conditions were completely clear. I knew the temperature and the average wind speed. I have my name on here as an observer. And then my survey vantage point was actually on site right there at the state park. And then I was able to access the area on foot. My site photo labels. The first photo was a north direction that I was looking. The second photo was an easterly direction that I was looking. And then the third photo was a westerly direction. And I did not take a south photo because that would have been a selfie of me on the bird tower. And there weren't really any birds in that picture. So then we're going to take a look a little further down the data sheet at actually the water bird survey portion in section 2, where we're documenting what we're seeing. So let me go back to my first field of view, my first photo. The great egret, he appears to be feeding. And so what I did was I recorded the name of the bird. I only saw one adult. His primary behavior was feeding through the duration of the survey. And what I noticed was he was in open water, and it was actually below the knee. And so let's take a look at that photo. I could see that the majority of the bird's legs are above the water level. So if I were to be standing in that water, it would be below my knee level. I was able to observe the bird feeding, and I determined it had medium success. What I noticed was the bird struck 8 times at the water, and 4 of those times I saw the head actually move up, and I could see that it had captured a fish and swallowed the fish. So I was able to record the feeding success for this particular bird. The next photo has to do with section 3, so I'm just going to skip it and go to the third photo. And so here are various birds. I've got a tricolored heron, I have a spoonbill, and I have a snowy egret. The snowy egret and the spoonbill appear to be feeding, and the tricolor heron is just standing there. I didn't observe any other feeding. It appears to be loafing. So as I record on my data, the tricolored heron, just one adult, and it appears to be loafing, and it's loafing in open water below the knee. The roseate spoonbill, I just noticed one. The feeding was the primary behavior, and I could not determine the feeding success, so I put NA. For the snowy egret, I had one adult and feeding, and it was above the water, open water below the knee, just like these other birds' habitat. I was able to determine a feeding success rate. I witnessed the bird strike 8 times, but only twice did I see it actually catch a fish. So then I was able to determine it had low success as far as the rate. What I didn't have in a picture here was the snowy egret that was flying over. And so there was one flowing egret that had flown over the survey area, and as it landed, so its primary activity was I watched it fly, and then towards the end of my survey, so this was less than 5 minutes left, I saw it actually land and just kind of stay there and hang out, which I determined is loafing behavior. And I witnessed this, the loafing behavior in the high marsh. Flying over, we typically aren't going to associate with any habitat type. So if you have a secondary behavior associated with flying over, then just go ahead and put the habitat type, the location, based on feeding, preening, and loafing, because it'll be intuitive for us to know that it's not, obviously they could be flying over the high marsh, but we'll be able to determine that. And what I also did here was put a number 2, because this was not the snowy egret that I witnessed feeding, did not fly over and then loaf. This was a second bird, so I put number 2. Now, if you did witness the snowy egret feeding and then flying overhead and landing in the high marsh to loaf, then you would not put a second number here, and you would not put an adult number here. What you would do is you would have one snowy egret feeding. The secondary behavior, if it's just flying to an area where it's loafing, then you would put that as your secondary behavior. But if it has a completely unusual behavior that just wasn't associated with feeding, or it was a lot more going on, then you could just pop down to the second line, put snowy egret, don't put the number of adults there. We'll intuitively know that it's the same snowy egret. And then you can put the association with its behavior and habitat type here. Some folks will also draw a little arrow to help us understand that the snowy egret they saw feeding was the same snowy egret that was loafing in the high marsh. If it's a completely different bird, you can definitely put a number to signify that there was actually 2 separate snowy egrets for this area. Okay, and then we'll go and take a look at this photo, which gives us more information on disturbance. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So one of the things that's very useful for the survey sheets is actually in the comment period. So here's a good example of what I put. These birds were feeding in open water, and they were within the marsh channels. So that kind of gives us some references to where these birds, especially if you're sending in pictures, that helps us understand. And then also I documented here the snowy egret 2. It flew around the area several times before it landed in high marsh, and it just sat there. So these little descriptions that you can put in the comment periods can really help clear up any of the information if we're looking at a specific area or if we're looking at certain behaviors. This we can use to associate with what you have recorded above. Then we get into section 3, which is disturbance. The picture we have here are 2 wade fishermen. And what I noticed was 2 gentlemen fishing. My survey period was about 15 or 20 minutes, and I noticed that these fishermen were out there for about 15 minutes. And then in the result here, I put that the birds avoided the fishermen, but they didn't necessarily fly completely out of the area. So they were avoiding the areas that the gentlemen were fishing, but they really didn't completely abandon their feeding efforts, and that's what we're interested in knowing. So down here in the comment period, I put the wade fishermen, they didn't leave the water or move very much, but they were talking loudly. And then the birds did not feed near them, but they weren't talking so loud that they scared the birds from the area. We know that some birds have tolerance for humans, and we're interested in kind of finding out a little more detail. So feel free to fill in that comment section as it applies to your survey to give us a little more description of what may be going on in that area. That's a basic survey that's being filled out. We are encouraging folks to keep up with us, as we have a lot of organized birding field trips with other folks that are doing surveys. That's a really great way for you to be able to come out and try some of the surveys with a group. If you're learning birds for the first time and you need help identifying them, our group birding surveys are also really great opportunities to get experience. You will learn a lot from experienced birders, and you'll really start to get the hang of filling out these data sheets and different scenarios that you can be asking questions. So many of these folks have been doing these surveys for a while. You can get in touch with us through our blog spot, audubonTERN.org, or we have through National Audubon Society and Audubon Texas, you can get in touch with us through the TERN Citizen Science page. As far as submitting data sheets, many people will either electronically fill them out or scan and email them back to tern@audubon.org, or some folks prefer to just mail the filled out data sheets at our offices. If you're in the Texas City area or you do volunteering at the preserve, you can certainly drop off your data sheets there. And then we also have other social media that we advertise our events and workshops, and that's on our Facebook page at Audubon TERN. So this concludes our TERN training. We'll hope that you will join the network of volunteers that are out collecting valuable information for bird data. As I had mentioned, all of the data that's being collected is stored in our database, but it's extremely valuable to wildlife professionals to help them understand bird behaviors, what habitats are being used by birds, and the abundance of birds that we have going on. So if you're interested in working towards this, definitely you may contact any of us here at the Coastal Program Office. And then we also have a lot of resources, water bird ID workshops, and supplementary information to help you advance through this training process so that you can be collecting this valuable data to help us preserve and protect our water birds. Thank you very much.